Directed by Benjamin Duffield, we are talking 2149, The Aftermath, which is also known as Confinement. However, this is a little bit confusing because this is a quote-unquote 2021 movie, but it is in fact a reissue of a 2016 movie called Darwin. Exactly the same film, just repackaged and renamed and re-released as a kind of new title. Now, normally this happens and sometimes films have different names, but they don't tend to get reissued as a separate film. But this is the case with this one. So it is actually a 2016 movie that came out then, but now just re-coming out in 2021. Anyway, so there you go. Bit of a weird kind of release strategy with this one, but there you have it. And this is kind of a I guess you want to call it young adult sort of style dystopian future movie, science fiction movie with social commentary, but at its heart is kind of a love story in a lot of ways. This certainly isn't an action orientated science fiction film. Essentially it takes place in a world where it's been ravaged by pollution, war, and society, what remains of it, are living in kind of self-contained little pods. So we have one person in a pod and they do everything within this pod, told by the powers that be that the air outside is toxic. Now, because they are living on their own in these pods, they don't speak. They just kind of do everything on computers and are very weak because all they do is sit down and do everything remotely. So people are very weak, and it focuses on this one sort of teenage boy called Darwin, whose pod gets hit by lightning and ultimately kind of shuts down, so he has to kind of go outside, initially thinking he's going to breathe in kind of toxic air, but finds out that it's actually completely fine, and ends up finding a bunch of kind of people who are living out in the wilderness and finding a girl kind of his own age and kind of get integrated into their family, but kind of having to relearn ultimately to become a real boy. But obviously he is worried that there's this kind of the powers that be, this government, this kind of Orwellian sort of style kind of overlords, corporate overlords, are wanting to basically get him back and find out what's happened. What will happen? You have to watch the movie to find out. So, what do we think that works about this movie? This was actually quite a pleasant and upbeat sort of science fiction movie. I did think it was going to be somewhat of a dour one, but it ends up being quite an uplifting film in some ways, with some positive messages in there. So it was quite nice. It almost has a Star Trek kind of optimistic view of humanity in a lot of ways. So that was quite a bit of a change of pace rather than the kind of like the the more threat-based kind of science fictions that maybe we sometimes watch. I'd like some of the kind of the way this movie depicts, even though obviously this future is filled with tragedy and kind of war and everything else, how people have evolved from stuff that they do today. Like, for example, when people type, it's all text speak, Obviously it's more exaggerated than it is now, but people barely kind of write anything, and it's all kind of text speak, and it all comes up on screen, and it's things like Darwin, when he kind of breaks out and has to communicate, he can only type, he can't actually speak because he hasn't spoken since he's got in the pod. So things like that I thought was very well thought out in regards to a kind of a trajectory where the human race kind of might go, and obviously over exaggerated kind of where it is now. Like, people are so fixated, the only outlet they have is video games. They never kind of get out, so they're just physically very weak and things like that. I thought it had some really good concepts in there, and I really kind of quite liked our main actor as well, who plays Darwin. A likeable kind of performance as a very innocent kind of boy who is discovering all this kind of new world. It's quite heartwarming, when he finds this kind of family that kind of take him in, and seeing them kind of interact and kind of learn and kind of teach him and how his kind of life changes and things like that. I thought was all good stuff. And you know, it's a very kind of like upbeat message ultimately, and it has commentary on, you know, even though with this disaster and things that has happened within this universe, we still have corporations trying to make a profit ultimately, and they get people in these pods and keep them in there and tell them that kind of the world is ultimately uninhabitable to keep them sort of like the status quo, keep their employees working and stuff like that, and mining these kind of minerals with kind of automated diggers and things like that. So obviously there's commentary on you know, corporate greed and things like this. Obviously all kind of filters down to obviously what we have today in a lot of ways. So this is certainly a social political movie in some respects, despite it being a kind of a science fiction movie as well. I thought all the acting was very good here. I really enjoyed the character work. I like the relationship between Darwin and Dara, who is kind of like his kind of girlfriend that he kind of meets and stuff. They have a very sweet and kind of touching relationship, and I thought that was all very kind of good. And the world that this movie takes place in, I think, is particularly interesting, and you know, full of possibilities. The movie, as I say, is a slow burn. So there is arguably not a lot happens if we kind of move into any kind of like maybe critiques. I think the setup for me was excellent, and you know, it's an intriguing setup, but it kind of feels like it doesn't know where to go in the kind of the second half of the movie, because ultimately there's not a lot of obstacles to overcome. Let me put it like this. So when the movie finishes as a whole, we think, well, kind of it ended up being not a particularly a bit struggle, if I'm honest. I mean, they kind of have this moment where towards the end where there's a reveal about, you know, what has happened to the powers that be, and I don't know if it completely made sense, because it kind of contradicted maybe a scene that had just happened, but nonetheless, it was kind of like you think, oh, it's kind of, that's it. It kind of ends up being a little bit of a damp squid, I have to say. The film feels a little bit without consequence because of it. There is also a narration which I don't think helps. I think the narration is quite distracting, because it's a Darwin who's obviously an adult and a lot, you know, not, you know, in the future from what we're seeing. And because we never see that person, or Darwin as an adult, we only ever see him as a teenager. Again, it kind of, it felt unnecessary, and it felt like it was added on maybe later and stuff like that. And you know, it didn't really help the film, and I actually think it just felt like a little bit exposition heavy. And there are a little bit of kind of ropey CGI. We have these kind of robotic drones. And this is maybe the one thing I didn't really understand, because we have these robotic drones which are clearly policing, you know, what people are doing, but it kind of goes in contradiction to what happens at the end, and that's all I'm going to say because I don't want to spoil it for you. And it doesn't really amount to much in regards to that. I still think this is a good film, in regards to, I think it has some good sort of interesting ideas about the futuristic world that this movie paints, and I like the performances. I just think the movie is a little bit lightweight, and a little bit kind of like inconsequential in some ways. The movie felt like it had a great setup, but even a great first half, and the second half was pleasant, it was okay, but it didn't really amount to much to me. But overall, I would still say this falls into the positive category, because there's still some good stuff, even though I don't think the second half of the movie is as good as the first. The first is strong, and even the second is still watchable. So I'll give this one a 6 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I shall look forward to you next time. Bye for now.